Hello and welcome to another virtual program with the Paul Sawyer Public Library. My name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian at Paul Sawyer. And we're so happy to see everybody joining us here tonight. Really appreciate you coming out. I know we had hoped that we would be back together by now, but we're just making the best of this as it is. And it's just lovely to see everybody. Hopefully we'll be able to be all together again soon. But in the meantime, we have some really great programming coming up for you. And this is one that we've very much been looking forward to tonight with kind of one of our neighbors here in downtown Frankfort and someone who's partnered with us many times before through the Kentucky Historical Society and otherwise. And just a great guy.
Oh, thanks.
Mr. Stuart Sanders. Stuart is the former executive director of the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association. He's the author of 4 books, including Murder on the Ohio Belle, which is his newest book, and that's what he will be discussing tonight. He also wrote Perryville Under Fire, the aftermath of Kentucky's largest Civil War battle, the Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky, and Maney's Confederate Brigade at the Battle of Perryville. And he is employed over at the Kentucky Historical Society. And what is your title there, Stuart?
I'm Director of Research and Collections.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we are thrilled to have you joining us here tonight to talk about Murder on the Ohio Belle. And I know you folks will probably have a lot of questions, and please don't be bashful. We'll have time at the end of the presentation where you can unmute yourself and ask some questions. Hopefully we can get a good conversation going, or feel free to drop those questions or comments in the chat box as the program begins here. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Stuart Sanders. Welcome. Please help me to welcome Stuart.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. Thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and hopefully this will work. See how we are here. All right. So thanks for being here, first of all. And Diane, thanks so much for having me again. It's always fun to partner with the Paul Sawyer Library on things. You guys are a great site, and I'm a huge fan of the work you do in Frankfort and with downtown Frankfort in particular. So thanks for everything that the Paul Sawyer Library does. And a few years ago, when I was researching another book project, I found myself scrolling through online newspapers doing research. And when I was digging through an issue from 1856, I found a short article about a dead man who was found floating in the Mississippi River tied to a chair. And so reading that, it sort of caught me by surprise. And I wondered, what happened to this man? Why was he murdered this way? Who had thrown him in the river to suffer? And so these questions started sort of spiraling through my mind. And I immediately sort of put that other book project on hold and started digging into researching, the fate of this drowned man on the Mississippi. And the result of that research is my latest book, Murder on the Ohio Belle, which is published by the University Press of Kentucky. And it really examines 2 killings that took place in 1856 on board a Cincinnati-based steamboat that ran between Cincinnati and New Orleans on the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. And it basically ran passengers and freight between Cincinnati and New Orleans during the height of the steamboat era. And I quickly realized that this story, which includes the history of the steamboat Ohio Belle, really, it went beyond those 2 murders. And in addition to examining interpersonal violence and those 2 murders, the book also explores vigilante justice, Southern honor culture, the tensions that existed along the Ohio River border during the antebellum era, fugitive slaves, the Civil War, and much, much more. And today I want to talk a little bit about, how did that man come to be thrown into the river, tied to a chair, and also look at some of those larger themes that sort of are ever present in that story too, and sort of swirl around it, and discuss how they affected life in the Ohio River Valley during the mid-19th century. I'll also talk a little bit about the Ohio Belle's rich Civil War history, because it was a vessel that actually served both the Union and the Confederate service during the Civil War. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. So on March 14th, 1856, the side-wheeled steamboat Ohio Belle arrived at the town of Smithland, Kentucky to pick up freight and to pick up passengers. And Smithland is located on the Ohio River, just above Paducah. And at the time, the passengers on the boat were really abuzz with talk about a famed actress named Matilda Heron, who was on board the vessel. And she was born in Ireland. She was raised in Pennsylvania. And Matilda Heron really, she'd studied acting in England. And then while she was sort of traveling around Europe, taking a break from her acting classes, she became enamored with a play called Camille, which had been written by Alexander Dumas, who's the author of The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. And so while she was in Europe, she translated Dumas' play from French into English. And then when she returned to the United States, she spent several years performing the play Camille to rave reviews up and down the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. So she essentially used steamboat travel as a way to get from city to city to perform this play that she was really enamored with. Camille is a tragic love story about a courtesan in France who's dying of tuberculosis. And it was said that Heron played the part with great emotional dexterity and depth. It was said that people openly wept in their seats while she portrayed this woman dying of consumption. And historians of the theater have really credited Matilda Heron for inventing the emotional school of acting. And there she was on board the Ohio Belle. And because of that, a few passengers at Smithland, really none of them noticed this sort of ragged but fashionably dressed Mississippian climb on board the boat at Smithland. And he said his name was J.B. Jones, and he said that he was the son of a prominent planter from Holly Springs, Mississippi. Now, 16 years later, one passenger who was on board remembered Jones's appearance on board the Ohio Belle. And he wrote, quote, "When the steamer arrived, there came on board a man who was evidently recovering from a drinking spree. His clothes were of good material and fitted him well, though they were somewhat impaired by use. His face was soiled, and his beard had grown to an uncomely length. His eyes were bloodshot and glared unnaturally. His clothes needed a change." So Jones, again, the son of a Mississippi planter, was very rumpled, but he had a highborn swagger, and he obviously appeared to be intoxicated. And when he lurched on board the Ohio Belle, he really presented himself as being a Southern gentleman of means. Now, residents of Smithland, Kentucky, who watched the Ohio Belle pull away from the wharf would have been familiar with this steamboat. At least 3 vessels called the Ohio Belle had plied the Cincinnati to New Orleans trade route since the 1830s, with one boat replacing the other. So they were constructed in 1839, 1843, and 1855, respectively. Every time a new Ohio Belle was built, it increased in size as river passage became much more important to the growth of the nation. And around that time, in 1856, there were about 700 steamboats that were running up and down Western waters, including the third Ohio Belle. And pictured here is actually the second Ohio Belle, which was constructed in 1843. And this photo comes from a incredible panoramic image that the Cincinnati Public Library owns, showing the Cincinnati riverfront. And I'm guessing this was taken at a time that the Ohio Belle was probably being refitted. It looks like it's in pretty rough shape, and they were probably, changing the engine out and changing the decks and rebuilding parts of the boat. So I would encourage you all, if you have any interest in sort of kind of Ohio River history, check out this 1848 panoramic image on the Cincinnati Public Library website. It's absolutely incredible. Now, although steamboat trade was important to economic growth, and while steamboats really allowed Louisville and Cincinnati and other river towns to grow from the 1830s to the 1850s, as we know, this type of travel was not without risk. And first, steamboats could run into snags or other underwater obstacles and sink. And since many 19th century Americans really never learned to swim, a sinking steamboat would have been a very terrifying and dangerous ordeal for those passengers. And with each boat having massive furnaces and boilers on board to increase steam for travel, the risk of fire or explosion was also ever present if you were traveling on one of these boats. Boilers were not ever or were sometimes not properly constructed. Sometimes they were made inconsistently. The metal wasn't strong enough, and there were no sort of real regulations that were enforced that sort of led to sort of a certain boiler strength. And because of that, because there was a lack of sort of good construction, a historian named Laura Davis has explained that on average, 21% of all river boats on Western waters and during the antebellum period burned or exploded. So again, about 1/5 of all boats that ever plied these rivers ended up burning, caught fire, or blew up. And this included, one of the victims of this was Mark Twain's brother, Henry Clemens, who died when the steamboat Pennsylvania exploded in June 1858. So even Mark Twain, was not immune from having family members who died as a result of steamboat explosions. And because of fires, explosions, ice on the water, other underwater obstacles like overturned trees that had slid into the water, because of that, this was dangerous travel, and most steamboats only survived on the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers for an average of 5 years. So any boat that was over 5 years old was considered old at that point, and also fairly lucky. This image here is the explosion of the Alfred Thomas, which exploded on the Ohio near Pittsburgh, I think it was, in 1860. So it sort of gives you an idea of what one of these explosions would have, it's an artist's rendering of it, at least, what it would have looked like. So the three boats that traveled under the name Ohio Belle from 1839 until the 1860s also faced these risks, again, fire, accident, or explosion. And although the records from the early period are somewhat scant, it appears that the first Ohio Belle that was constructed in Cincinnati in 1839 probably fell victim to either a fire or a snag on the water. Now, the second Ohio Belle that's pictured here, again in 1848, and it was actually part of a nationally significant fugitive slave case in Cincinnati in 1845 that I describe in the book. This boat, this version of it, was likely destroyed in 1854, probably a fire, I think. And a replacement vessel, the third to bear that name, was then constructed. And it was on this boat that was called an elegant passenger packet, upon which the intoxicated Mississippian J.B. Jones got on board in March of 1856. Now, again, Jones, who looked drunk when he got on board the Ohio Belle, as soon as he got on board, sort of set his luggage aside and immediately went to the boat's saloon and started drinking again, started downing liquor. And at approximately 11 a.m., while the Ohio Belle was between Smithland and Cairo, Illinois, Jones decided to go to the boat's barber for a shave. So he stumbled out of the bar, went down to the barber, got in the chair, and got a shave and a haircut. Now, to pay for this, he presented the barber with a $20 bill. And the barber then went to the boat's clerk, who was sort of in charge of everything going on the boat. The barber handed this $20 bill to Hiram Stevens, who's the clerk, to get change. Now, Stevens was a Cincinnati resident with a wife and 4 children. He examined the money and he immediately sort of got suspicious and claimed that it was a counterfeit bill, and he refused to accept it. Now, when the barber told Jones that his money had been rejected, the Mississippian was very irritated, but he handed the barber a $10 bill. And Stevens, the boat clerk, claimed that that money was also counterfeit, and he returned it. Now, when Stevens rejected the money twice, claiming it was counterfeit, the Mississippian became furious. One witness later said that, quote, "The strange man flew, as it were, into a rage, and he rushed out of the shop in a wild and desperate manner." Now, Jones found Stevens, the boat's clerk, and he asked him why he thought the bill was counterfeit. And Stevens simply said, "I recognize it, that it's a forgery." Well, Jones became even more enraged. He started to curse and scream at the clerk. And a reporter later wrote that Jones, quote, "paced the cabin, abusing the boat, and Captain Stevens particularly, using vile and improper language in the hearing of the ladies." And so, people were shocked by Jones's drunken behavior. And Stevens essentially told him, he said, "Look, calm down, or I'm going to remove you from the cabin." Jones kept ranting. And finally, Stevens grabbed the drunken Mississippian by the arm, told the Southerner that he'd violated the rules of the boat, and walked him forcibly out of the cabin. Now, to Jones, who was the son of a Mississippi planter, this was a grave offense because Stevens, who was a lower class clerk, in Jones's eyes, had put his hands on this upper class planter's son and had manhandled him out of the cabin. So this insulted the Mississippian, it impugned his manhood, it sort of insulted his sense of honor. And during the mid-19th century, the code of honor called for an immediate response if someone from a lower class either assaulted you or insulted you, for that matter. So because of that, since Jones felt insulted by this lower class man, he would not challenge him to a formal duel, as would have happened if they'd been of the same social standing. Instead, the drunken Mississippian decided to deal with this affront immediately. So after Stevens escorted Jones out of the cabin, Stevens told Jones, he said, "Look, if you calm down, we can resolve this issue." But Jones, however, was in no mood for a compromise. He immediately pulled a pistol from his pocket and he shot Stevens in the left side of the chest, just below his armpit. and Stevens fell and he died in about 15 minutes. Now, a Cincinnati newspaper later wrote that Stevens was, quote, extensively known and beloved and respected in this community. And after shooting Stevens, Jones turned and he ran. Now, Jones's murder of Stevens proved that the luxurious surroundings of a steamboat were not free from violence. And unsurprisingly, the murder of Stevens and the shooting on board the Ohio Belle was really not an isolated incident. And instead, and as a reflection of 19th century society in general, Stevens' death was really just one of many deadly acts that were perpetrated on board steamboats on Western waters. And, like the general public, crew members and passengers could have a propensity for violence. In addition, on board a steamboat, you have a combination of alcohol, concealed weapons, and gambling, and that sort of would prove to be a volatile mix many times. So there were fights, there were shootings, there were stabbings, there were intentional drownings. Men were beaten to death with firewood, and there were many other lethal episodes that occurred despite these really deluxe accommodations that were found on board these vessels. So hostility between crew members could even lead to homicide. And in 1846, for example, there was an engineer on board the steamboat Ohio Belle who bickered with a fireman. And then after they got in an argument, the one engineer ended up striking the fireman. These are the guys who loaded sort of the wood into the furnace to keep it running. He knocked the fireman against the furnace, and he burned him so severely as to cause his death. And a reporter said caused his death in great agony the next morning. The engineer ended up fleeing the boat when it arrived in Louisville, so he was sort of able to escape. In 1859, there was a man named Owen Denigan who stabbed and killed John Moore, who's a fireman on the W.A. Violet. Denigan slipped off the boat and also escaped, but other perpetrators who tried to evade capture after committing crimes on steamboats were not so fortunate. In 1852, there was a steamboat called the Yuba, and it traveled from Cincinnati to New Orleans. And in this instance, much like the case on the Ohio Belle, there's a passenger who became troublesome. And again, this is a scene very reminiscent of Jones's murder of Stevens. And on board this vessel, there's a watchman named William Jenkins, who's essentially sort of an onboard security guard. He took this unruly passenger, sort of pulled him out of the cabin, and the passenger promptly pulled a Bowie knife and stabbed Jenkins and killed him. The murderer jumped overboard to escape, but he was found drowned in the river the next day. Again, a lot of Americans did not know how to swim. So on the Ohio Belle, after Jones shot and killed Stevens, he made a terrible mistake for a number of reasons. Murder, of course, in the first place, but secondly, he killed a man on a steamboat with no way to escape except to jump overboard. And moreover, he'd also killed a member of the crew. So as he still had the smoking revolver in his hand, Jones raced up to the top deck. He was, chased by crew members and passengers who were determined to catch him. And before he could jump overboard to try to escape, crew members caught him, they knocked him to the ground, and they ended up beating him severely. And the scene soon became chaotic. As Jones was being beaten by crew members, passengers crowded in. Some were calling for him to be drowned, others were calling for him to be hanged. But some on board sort of wanted justice, legal justice to prevail, and they begged that Jones be taken to a town along one of the rivers for trial. Finally, though, the justice-minded on board sort of prevailed, and they prevented Jones's summary execution. In fact, it was likely the famous actress Matilda Heron, again pictured here, who probably prevented a lynching. One reporter wrote, as soon as he was captured, one end of a strong rope was placed around Jones's neck and preparations were made to string him up at the juncture. Miss Heron, the actress who was on board, appeared and made a strong appeal to them on behalf of the young man and insisted upon their turning him over to the laws of the country to be dealt with. The execution was abandoned. So Matilda Heron, again, this famous actress who was sort of invented the emotional school of acting, was sort of well-trained to make this emotional appeal. She calmed everyone down. And in this instance, at least, it saved Jones from the vigilante's noose. So the pleas of those who call for justice were answered. And for now, Jones's life had been spared. But the Mississippian was not treated gently by any means. The crew grabbed a rope to restrain him. And as you can imagine, if anyone knew how to tie knots, it was sailors during the 19th century. And they ended up wrapping his entire body in one single rope. And a reporter later wrote that the cord was lashed, quote, across his mouth so tight that it stretched the corners of his mouth back considerably, cutting them so that the blood ran down his jaws and leaving him in the greatest agony. So the crew would not kill Jones, but they would certainly make him suffer at this point, since he had murdered a fellow crewman. They then took him below deck, leaving him bound, and they left him on board, or left him tied to a chair down in the engine room. So At this point, though, Jones was one of the lucky ones. Lynching and shipboard justice was really not uncommon on Western steamboats. Robbery, violence, murder was not taken lightly by crew members, and these crew members often took the law into their own hands. Lawbreakers on steamboats could be flogged, whipped, or beaten before being placed on shore or left on an island to sort of be abandoned on a river. And some had their heads shaved to brand them as criminals, and others, like Jones, faced hanging or drowning at the hands of the crew. In 1841, for example, there's a man named Edward Jarvis, who was a traveler on the Mississippi River, and he saw what happened to thieves when they crept into staterooms and cut open the pants pockets of fellow travelers and basically stole their money out of their pockets. And he talks about how two men were detected for stealing a coat and for other money, and the captain on shore basically set them down somewhere in the wilderness, as he called it. And he said, "This is the usual summary judgment and punishment of such fellows." So again, having your head shaved and being sort of left on an island somewhere trapped was seen as being just punishment for thieves on board boats. But these two thieves were actually fortunate to not be on the steamboat Chancellor in 1853. In July, as that vessel traveled on the Mississippi River, several thieves were caught, and they were sort of tried on the boat. There's sort of this kind of drumhead court, and 5 of them were severely whipped and flogged for their crimes. Now, when you consider episodes of vigilante justice on board steamboats, it quickly becomes apparent that shipboard hangings and mob rule on board boats were simply a reflection of cities along the Ohio River. And in the 1850s, mob violence occurred in Louisville, in Cincinnati, and in other communities. Some of you, for example, might be familiar with Bloody Monday in Louisville, which were sort of xenophobic election day riots that occurred in Louisville in August 1855, just a few months before Jones killed Stevens on board the Ohio Belle. And on that election day, members of the American or the Know Nothing Party attacked German and Irish citizens to essentially prevent them from voting. And false rumors had spread that Catholic and foreign-born residents had been stashing firearms and were prepared to attack American Party voters during the election. So this sort of whipped all these American Party members into a frenzy, and they ended up really performing some of the worst mob violence in Kentucky history. And sort of single episodes of violence sort of exploded into mob violence as gangs ransacked and burned breweries and other immigrant-owned businesses. And it's sort of the worst episode of the Bloody Monday riots, which is pictured here, is when basically a mob went down to Quinn's Row, located in what is now downtown Louisville, which is in a set of Irish-owned houses located downtown. They lit the buildings on fire, and all of those fleeing out of the buildings were shot down and were murdered in the street. And so the true number of casualties is unknown. We do know that dozens of people died in Louisville during, again, this sort of worst episode of 19th century mob violence that took place just a few months before this murder on the Ohio Belle. There are other historians who have sort of tracked down mob violence in other cities along the Ohio River, like Cincinnati had several instances of mob violence during this period. And, so it's unsurprising that sort of these sailors on board the Ohio Belle, were sort of quick to perpetrate their own sort of vigilante justice at the time. So again, this is unsurprising at the time, but, thanks to the actress Matilda Heron, Jones was saved, or was he? So what happened to J.B. Jones, this murder on board the Ohio Belle? So the captain of the boat, a Louisville native named John Sebastian, tried to leave him in Cairo, Illinois for trial, but lawyers there told the captain that the court would likely release Jones because the killing happened outside of their jurisdiction. So Sebastian tried again, and as the boat traveled down to Hickman, Kentucky, he planned to take him to Hickman, Kentucky at that time, and kind of sent the boat farther down the river. And when he was at Cairo, though, Sebastian hired a company to ship the body of the murdered clerk up to Cincinnati. And 3 days after Stevens was murdered, he was buried in Cincinnati in Spring Grove Cemetery there. And again, he left a widow and 4 children. So J.B. Jones, though, never made it to Hickman for trial, and he never faced, legal justice for murdering the clerk Hiram Stevens. So instead, the night after the boat left Cairo, Jones disappeared from the Belle. Although passengers and crew members never, they always claim they never knew what happened to him. His corpse was later found bobbing by a sandbar in the Mississippi River tied to a chair. So the crew, passengers, or either a combination of the two, had extracted their own form of riverine vigilante justice against Jones. But there is, however, a twist to the story, and I was sort of shocked to find this as I was doing research. And after Jones's corpse was pulled from the river, it was discovered that he wasn't who he said he was. While he was from Holly Springs, Mississippi, J.B. Jones was not his real name. He was the son of a prominent planter, but he was on the run from a terrible past, basically traveling the rivers under an assumed name to avoid justice for another horrific crime. So ironically, though, sort of extra legal justice ultimately befell him when he committed another crime on board the Ohio Belle. And although he escaped punishment after committing a murder the first time on board the Ohio Belle, he could not escape the sort of extra legal justice and could not run from punishment. So while I won't reveal Jones's true identity to you today, I will cruelly leave that for readers of the book. I want to talk a little bit about what happened to one of the most important characters in the book, which is the steamboat, the Ohio Belle. And after Stevens' murder, the Ohio Belle quickly started hauling passengers and freight from Cincinnati to New Orleans. So this passenger disappears off the boat. He's found drowned. The crew doesn't care. They just keep, rolling the boat up and down the rivers. The Belle always carried sort of an interesting array of not only passengers, but also freight. In March 1860, for example, the Ohio Belle took a load to Cincinnati that included bacon, hams, onions, potatoes, cheese, candles, sausages, whiskey, plows, tobacco, and many, many more items. But as we know, in 1860, sort of this profitable trade was ultimately interrupted because of sectional tensions between the North and the South. And when the Civil War erupted, the Ohio Belle amazingly continued to haul passengers and people up and down the rivers. And so even though the Ohio Belle was owned in Cincinnati, it was an Ohio-owned boat, by the time Louisiana and other states in the Deep South had seceded from the Union, the vessel was still going up and down the rivers, delivering passengers and goods to New Orleans. And to me, this is a really, sort of fascinating part of the secession crisis, because the states are leaving the Union as they're seceding from the nation. Northern-owned boats continue to travel up and down the river, stopping at southern ports, selling goods, making money, and commerce, surprisingly, continued for a while. But after April 1861, though, this travel became pretty problematic. So on April 15th, the Belle was docked at Evansville, Indiana. They were loading freight for another trip to Louisiana. But 3 days earlier, Southern forces had fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. And the fort surrendered the next day. And while the Ohio Belle waited in Evansville to get fully loaded before they traveled back down to New Orleans, President Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to crush the rebellion. So Texas had seceded in February, joining Louisiana and 6 other states. And Lincoln's call for soldiers, again, these 75,000 troops to stop the rebellion from happening, this really pushed the Upper South to start seceding. So on April 17th, Virginia left the Union, and then Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee soon followed. So despite the fractured Union, though, the Ohio Belle continued southward, reaching New Orleans in April, on April 21st, again, about a week after the fall of Fort Sumter. So although the trip downriver was initially peaceful, when the boat unloaded freight at New Orleans, unsurprisingly, the crew found themselves swept up in this conflict. So upstream, you had secessionists in Memphis block the Mississippi River, and pro-Confederate residents knew that the Ohio Belle and other northern-owned boats were leaving New Orleans for their return journey northward and home, and they vowed to seize these northern-owned vessels really for the good of the South. And so things were taking sort of a tragic turn for river travel during this time. Now, at the time, both Unionists and secessionists were playing sort of a game of retribution. If you take my property, I'm to take yours. And in May 1861, residents of Cairo, Illinois, had seized about $175,000 worth of weapons that had been bound for Tennessee because they captured a southern steamboat called the C.E. Hillman. And in response, secessionists in Memphis decided to detain the Ohio Belle and other northern-owned vessels until reparations were made for these taken weapons. So after leaving New Orleans, the Ohio Belle stopped at Napoleon, Arkansas to pick up wood. And several weeks earlier, Cincinnati residents had seized arms and ammunition and 4 cannons that were intended for Confederate forces Confederate Arkansas troops at that point. The state's governor, Henry Rector, who's pictured here, was furious about this, and Rector blamed the confiscation on, quote, the people of Cincinnati having instinctive proclivities toward public plunder. So again, sort of insulting Cincinnatians as his arms and ammunition were seized. And Rector was determined to avenge, this insult. He ordered that Arkansas troops along the Mississippi River should seize all Cincinnati-owned steamboats. That included the Ohio Belle. And when the boat arrived in Napoleon, Arkansas, armed secessionists had a cannon tied to the bank and a militia unit armed with rifles, and they ended up seizing the vessel. So the Ohio Belle was then stuck in Southern hands, even though, again, it was a Cincinnati-owned boat. They sent the crew members up to New Orleans, who then sort of angrily took a boat ride back to Cincinnati and home. But the Ohio Belle served the Southern Army for a number of months as a troop transport, a hospital ship, and also a scouting vessel. And it actually remained in Confederate hands for nearly a year. But in March 1862, a Union flotilla ended up attacking a Confederate-controlled island on the Mississippi River. And when the Ohio Belle appeared in front of it, a Union gunboat fired at it, and the Belle sort of scampered away. But as the island fell to Union forces, Confederate troops tried to scuttle the boat. They tried to put a hole in it and sink it. But it ended up getting sort of rescued by the Union forces. They repaired it and then started using the boat for their own use. So even though the owners of the Ohio Belle in Cincinnati wanted to get this boat back, now that it was back in Union hands, the Union Army refused, and they used the boat, and it had a long career serving the Union Army. It transported Confederate prisoners. It acted as a hospital ship. It transported Union soldiers. We do know that multiple Union soldiers actually died on the boat when it was in use as a hospital ship. And those poor, victims of probably disease were wrapped in blankets or sheets and were simply buried in the river at the time when they passed away. We do know that the Belle also took Union troops on a mission of retribution. In September of 1862, after Confederate guerrillas had fired on a Union supply ship from Randolph, Tennessee, Union General William Sherman ordered that Randolph be burned as a punishment for harboring these guerrillas. The Ohio Belle transported Union soldiers to the town, and as the steamboat neared the shore, one Ohio soldier later wrote, "The quiet citizens began to scamper like rats from a foundering vessel. Oh, but they did run. The whole town felt their impending doom and were satisfied that it was just, although it was hard. The Union troops laid Randolph, Tennessee to waste. They burned every building except for the Methodist church, leaving that church's steeple standing as a reminder of what happened when local civilians supported Confederate guerrillas in Tennessee." And about 60 buildings were actually put to the torch. Eventually, though, the Union Army decided that smaller boats, like the Ohio Belle, sort of a smaller boat by that time, were no longer needed for the Union war efforts. They returned the Ohio Belle to its owners, who eventually received about $19,000 for the boat's service to the government. And according to one estimate I found, in 1863, $19,000 in 1863 would be worth about $600,000 today. So they did get a princely sum of money for having the boat being used for a couple of years. The vessel immediately returned to running trade from Cincinnati to New Orleans because New Orleans had fallen to the Union Army. It was under Union control after May 1862. So it avoided sort of Southern controlled areas, but it continued to take goods and passengers between Cincinnati and New Orleans. And it still sometimes had a contract with the federal government for transporting troops too. Now, the crew was frequently reminded that they traveled through a war zone. And in March 1864, they actually rescued a 70-year-old man who had been shot and wounded by guerrillas. And so they rescued him, sort of treated him well, patched up his wounds, and sort of sent him on his way. But in another instance, 2 soldiers on board the Ohio Belle were actually shot and were wounded while they traveled on board this vessel. Now, the ultimate fate of the Ohio Belle really mirrored that of the entire steamboat industry. And after the Civil War, the use of steamboats continued to decline as railroad lines expanded across the United States. This was basically a death knell for the Ohio Belle, which by the end of the conflict was an aged vessel. Again, most Western steamboats lasted an average of 5 years. And, it was almost 10 years old by the end of the Civil War. Furthermore, because the boat had, spent years as a soldier's transport carrying sick and wounded soldiers, you can imagine the boat was probably in fairly rough shape after the Civil War. It was no longer sort of the luxurious vessel that sort of gained glowing articles in newspapers around the South. But in the late summer of 1865, one newspaper article pictured here appeared in newspapers noting there was a large government sale of steamboats, wharf barges, and other property. And, the federal government was selling a number of steamboats that had seen service under the federal government during the Civil War. And these were all sold at New Orleans, including as I've circled here in red, the side-wheeled steamer of the Ohio Belle. It is sold in New Orleans to parties in Alabama for about $6,200, which was a far cry from her estimated value of $20,000 from just a year earlier. So the value of the boat did decline. And also, this is an instance of supply and demand too, with all these, the federal government selling all these steamboats. There was certainly a glut in the market, and it drove prices down for these boats. But the steamboat's name would not survive the sale. And upon being sold, the boat was promptly renamed the Alabama Belle. And its new owners sort of sent it up and down the Alabama River, transporting goods and people to Mobile, Montgomery, and other landings. And they probably changed the name because, having the Ohio Belle, having the boat named after a northern state probably was not good business in Alabama at the end of the Civil War. In September of 1866, however, the Belle sold again. Newspapers ran a notice stating that capitalists and steamboatmen should take note because the auction house was selling the fine steamboat Alabama Belle and all of its furniture and all of its apparel and everything inside. And the newspaper added that, quote, "as a safe and profitable investment, she will no doubt prove invaluable, and the sale should be well attended." Now, sadly, though, the Belle did not survive long after the auction. And in 1867, after a miraculous 12-year run on the Mississippi, again, most boats lasted about 5 years. The Ohio Belle, the third version of it, lasted 12. It was broken up in 1867. It was likely sold for scrap. And so as I was working on this book, as the boilers and the boards and the wheel and the bell and, all the accoutrements related to this boat were being taken away. And as, the boards were being pulled up and dismantled from this once, grand boat, I wondered if the then owners and those who were pulling her apart knew the history of this boat and sort of the tales of murder and desperate men who once rode on the grand Ohio Belle. So thanks for your time tonight. And that's sort of the story about the murder on the boat and the vigilante justice that went on, and then also a little bit about the boat's Civil War history. I'd be happy to answer any questions. My contact info is also listed here if you ever have any questions. But thanks for having me. And Steve, it's nice to see you. Thanks for being here.
All right. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you have a question that you'd like to ask.
Kurt, I have a question. I enjoyed your talk. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
You were talking about how luxurious, though, how Belle was. Was that and passenger transport? Was that typical for that type of steamship at the time?
Oh, you broke up a little, Chris. I'm sorry. Can you repeat that? You said it was luxurious, but
Sure. Yeah, you were saying that it was a luxurious vessel with the barber shop and a saloon. Was that typical for vessels that were making that trip from Ohio to New Orleans?
it was. There was sort of a competition between boats. Which one could be A, the most luxurious, number one, and then B, what boats could sort of make the best time between different ports, because the faster these boats could go, the more likely people were to ride on it because it would shorten their travel time. The dangerous part about that is that a lot of times steamboat engineers and captains would sort of load the engines with firewood or coal, would sort of get the engines super hot. They'd build up steam. They would hold down safety valves to keep the pressure built up so the boats could go faster. And that would end up leading to explosions too. So, the desire for speed also led to a lot of accidents. But that sort of the luxurious surroundings, that when you think about kind of the typical Mississippi boat, that was very standard. There are also sort of lesser boats too that, weren't as nice. It sort of people would pay sort of a cheaper fare to travel on those. But the more luxurious the boat, the faster time that it had, the more that the owners could charge to get people sent. So yeah, they were pretty luxurious at the time, but dangerous too.
Yeah, I know that was a big time for influx of German immigrants into the port of New Orleans. Or I assume they're on those cheaper boats most of the time.
Yeah, probably. And they had varying degrees. The costs were different depending on where you rode on the boat. So if you had a cabin, it'd be something like $15 to travel downstream, $30 to travel upstream. But if you were a deck passenger exposed to the elements, or if you were sort of down in the bowels of the ship, among the pigs and the cows, things like that. It was a lot cheaper. So there was a boat called the Moselle in 1838 that left Cincinnati, and it was sort of known as one of the fastest boats on the river. And it picked up a ton of German immigrants just north of Cincinnati at Fulton, Ohio. And all these immigrants got on board, but the arrival boat had left about 20 minutes earlier. And so the captain was determined to catch and overtake this boat. So he kept the steam built up. And as soon as the boat pulled out, there was one revolution of the wheels, and the poor Moselle exploded, killing well over 100 people, including a lot of German immigrants. So, that story is sort of not only talks about immigration on Western waters, but also the dangers of that sort of travel when captains were, more interested in gaining a reputation than in ensuring the safety of a boat. And sadly, stories like that abound all up and down the Ohio. So some sad history too. It's sad what happened to a lot of the people who traveled.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for being here.
So I was curious how the times and the things that were going on were things that Mark Twain would have experienced as a riverboat person.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this sort of is, this story and others are sort of full of that cast of characters that, you read about in Twain. I talk about there's a gambler on board the Ohio Belle. He actually was a fairly well-known gambler. He wrote a memoir that came out, I think after the Civil War, but he talks about being a gambler on board these antebellum boats, and he would play 3-card Monte, where the gambler would flip 3 cards, and you had to sort of pick the face card. But of course, it was all a scam. And Captain John Sebastian, who's the captain of the Ohio Belle, and this gambler writes about this in his memoir, actually decided to play, and the gambler knew he was sunk because he ended up taking the captain's money, and the captain immediately shut down the game. And he later went up to the captain and said, "Hey, why don't you come win your money back?" And so he let the captain win his money back, and then he kept playing. One man evidently bet $5,000, probably all the money he had, because he was convinced he could beat this gambler in 3-card Monte, lost all of his money, and then went up to the deck and got sick over the side of the boat. He was so kind of horrified that he lost all his money. So, these stories that Twain talks about, again, how amazing it was that these pilots could, on a stormy night, they could guide these massive boats, with very, loose controls on board, guide them downriver in a storm. It's all true. And I don't know how a lot of these pilots did it, but I mean, they just, incredibly brave men. And the captain of Captain John Sebastian, who's captain of the Ohio Belle, actually, when the boat was captured by Confederates, he immediately went back to Cincinnati, joined the Union Army, and became a pilot on a Union gunboat. So he sort of was extracting revenge on the Confederates. And he ended up, when the gunboat he was on was called the A.O. Tyler, when the Tyler fought the Confederate ironclad, the Arkansas, Captain Sebastian actually was wounded and lost his arm, from a cannonball in this battle. So, even a number of the crew members on the Ohio Belle had sort of pretty violent Civil War experiences. But after the war, he ended up having a pretty incredible career out west, settled near what is now Emporia, Kansas. Was a steamboat captain for a while too, but then was the county treasurer in Cincinnati for a long time, made a lot of money, then went out west to Kansas and became a very prominent cattle farmer. And, so you figure these guys who were, again, taking these massive steamboats up and down the Ohio River on moonless nights, a Civil War battle, they just had a lot of grit to them, which is pretty amazing. So it was kind of fun to do that sort of research too. But long answer to the short question, yes, the things Twain writes about the Mississippi sort of is really, a lot of it, I think, is based on his own experiences.
Yep. And it's such a contrast from people who maybe never traveled more than 40 miles from their home.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Very exotic.
It really is. And, that's why, it led to westward expansion in the country. I mean, it led to more sort of cultural exchanges. As Chris mentioned, it led to, immigration to different places too. And you see why, these Ohio River towns like Cincinnati and Louisville, both in particular on the Ohio River, and St. Louis too, just became these massive economic powerhouses. It was because of the river. And that's why places like Lexington, did not do as well, even though, Lexington was once the Athens of the West, it was called, but it got surpassed by Louisville, really because of steamboat trade.
Mhm.
It's pretty fascinating. I mean, newspapers from the time run, different freight that they were carrying, from back east. It's pretty amazing what they were able to ship. And again, places like Cincinnati that became sort of the hog capital of the United States, were able to sort of process the hogs and, sell pork and make candles out of the rendered hog fat and do all this. And you could just sort of get a sense of the massive amount of industry that was going on, and how steamboats played an important part of that.
Good. Thank you.
So I've turned into a steamboat nerd, which I never thought would happen. It's kind of strange.
Didn't Cincinnati had the nickname Porkopolis at one time, didn't it?
Yeah, it's called Porkopolis, which I think is great.
Porkopolis. Yeah.
Yeah, and tens of thousands of hogs that they would, process. During several months. It was only a short period. 3 or 4 months. They would and the river must have been awful because they dumped a lot of the refuse into the river. So certainly a pretty grim place, I'm sure, at the time. But check out that 1848 panoramic image of Cincinnati that the Cincinnati Library has. It's pretty incredible. And the picture I use is, I've really zoomed in for the picture of the Ohio Belle. It's amazing that with that old glass plate negatives that they use, you can zoom in and get that clarity. It's pretty amazing.
Stuart, do passenger lists exist for some of these trips?
That's a great question. They did. So a lot of times people would sign, the clerk would have basically a registry, a book that people would sign in on. And so that's why after a steamboat explosion, more often than not, the register would be lost. And so they wouldn't know how many people were on board or who was actually on board. So in the weeks after explosions, you would see newspapers trying to recreate passenger lists. And so sometimes they could do it. And in the case of the Moselle, the one that had all the Germans on board that blew up in Cincinnati in 1838, when they picked up all those Germans, the captain was in a rush, so none of them signed on. And so people just, disappeared. And a lot of family members never knew what happened. Bodies often went unclaimed, that you'd find corpses miles down the river sometimes. And, communities would just sort of bury them in unknown graves at that point. Or loved ones would write letters, they'd say, hey, my husband had a gold ring, a gold watch. He always kept, this on him, or they'd find papers on board someone sort of noting who they were. And it's kind of honestly fascinating how they sometimes figured out who people were after these grim explosions. The Moselle is kind of interesting too. It's sort of an odd sidebar. Right before it blew up, one of the passengers who was going to get on board was future Confederate General Robert E. Lee, believe it or not. Lee was traveling to St. Louis to be an engineer for the U.S. Army, but he had friends in Newport, so they took a boat over to Newport and ended up missing the boat when it left Cincinnati and went up to Fulton, and they were hoping to catch it when it came back. And before that happened, the Ohio Belle exploded, destroying the Lee's family luggage, which they'd already had on board. But, one wonders, what would have happened had Lee died in the explosion of the Moselle in 1838, sort of one of those, twists of history that he ended up surviving. So a near miss that sort of, changed the course of American history in a lot of ways. Really. So, it's amazing sort of how many lives were touched by, steamboats during this period, and then also the accidents too. It's amazing when you look at one thing I talk about in the book. There were a few passenger lists. They did kind of a straw poll among passengers on the Ohio Belle for a couple of presidential elections, and listed where people were from, and they were from all over the nation. So you had people from almost every existing state who were on board the boat at that time. And, cultures really clashed. Again, as I think the experience of Jones and Stevens is really emblematic of that. Is you have this sort of Mississippian steeped in Southern honor culture, ends up getting insulted by this, Cincinnati resident who had no sense of that, and it ended up costing the poor clerk his life. And so, cultures clash sometimes violently. And again, with this, Chris, as you mentioned, these immigrants on board also created a whole other, complex layer. And the stories among enslaved people on board boats too, because a lot of times crew members were actually enslaved African Americans who were leased out by their owners to work on these boats, as barbers perhaps, carrying freight as firemen. And a lot of times, when the boat would stop at Cincinnati, these enslaved African Americans used this as an opportunity to seek freedom, and they would leave the boat and would go off. And these boats, even though the Ohio Belle, one thing that I found interesting, even though it was owned by Cincinnati owners, it also transported enslaved people, and so it played a part in sort of supporting slavery economically. And that led to this fugitive slave case that I talk about in the book. It was from about 1845 or so. And Salmon Chase was actually an attorney in that case too. So, he was part of the Lincoln administration later. So, a few famous people also got involved peripherally with the Ohio Belle and this fugitive slave case.
I think another interesting point along your line about all the people that were died and no one knew who they were, that if you wanted to change your identity, you could use that as a way to do that, to say that person died and I'm a new person.
Right. And I mean, if you survived, it'd be a perfect way to escape, actually, and sort of, or slip away and, assume that new identity. And during the Civil War, actually, soldiers did that. They'd, wander off after a battle. And, I've forgotten who it was, but there was it was Clara Barton, actually, after the war in Washington, D.C. She ran an office that tried to find missing soldiers, missing Union soldiers. And evidently, a lot of times these soldiers would survive. The soldiers who were not missing, they'd sort of escaped and started a new life in California, would write her a letter and saying, I do not want to be found. I've started a new life. Don't come looking for me. And so, there is actual, documented evidence of people using the Civil War to sort of escape and their past lives and start a new life somewhere else. And I'm sure it happened with steamboat explosions too. And I've been, they happen all over the country. I've been actually doing some research on steamboat explosions in California in the 1850s too, up and down the Sacramento River. Some pretty harrowing stories of that too. It's always the same story, captains or owners who are sort of setting safety aside for profit. And, in a time when there was little regulation, it had disastrous consequences. And actually, in one episode there, I'm researching a steamboat called the Pearl. There were Chinese immigrants on board that about 40 died because they were all on the deck. This happened with the Germans too. The deck passengers would crowd to the front. They'd be right under the boilers. When the boilers would explode, sadly, scores would be instantaneously killed as a result of that. So where you were on the boat, a lot of times, either helped or hindered your effort to survive. So I'm learning a lot of weird things about 19th century American history that I never thought I would that I'd know. But
Anybody else have any other questions or comments?
I'm real fun
Stuart,
at a
have
dinner
you done
party.
any-
Let me tell you, all these stories of. Go ahead, Steve. I'm sorry.
Have you done any work yet on the river boats that plied the Kentucky River, the Cumberland River, that came inland more? I know there's a lot of it because
Right.
there's a history of that in my family and things like that went all the way up the Cumberland, Burkesville.
Yeah, not too much. I think it's sort of kind of a forgotten part of transportation history in a lot of ways. So I think people nowadays don't really, think about these smaller boats on, basically what were tributaries feeding into the Ohio. So not something I've done yet. I've looked a little bit at a few accidents that took place, but I think it's fertile, unripe ground for researchers and historians to look at. So maybe down the road, I don't know, but yeah, I actually found out recently. I think he was a great grandfather in Louisville who went, I guess, was part of a volunteer fire brigade, and as the fire truck he was on, again pulled by horses. I think this was the 1830s or 40s. There were 3 boats that were on fire in Louisville on the wharf, and as he was on the back of this fire rig, the hose got wrapped around his neck, pulled him off, and he ended up falling and dying. And so, here I am just sort of drawn to these sort of horrible steamboat accident stories. And lo and behold, I have family history tied to a steamboat fire. So it's sort of odd how things like that sometimes happen. I was kind of, I don't know, kind of creeped me out a little bit to find it, but pretty interesting to me, at least. I found it pretty interesting. But I was
Was
sort of
there a
playing.
registry for steamboats? Was
What's
there
that?
any kind of a licensing or registry for the steamboats?
There was. So after the Moselle blew up in 1838, again, that's the one that killed all those German immigrants. Congress finally, after much pressure, there'd been in 1838, I mean, gosh, a ton of accidents, sort of one after the other. One on the lower Mississippi River was actually carrying Creek Indians. It was part of the Trail of Tears, and about 300 Native Americans drowned in that accident. There was another one called the Ben Sherrod that caught on fire and burned up, killing dozens of people. And there were, 5 or 6 or 7. Then the Moselle happened. And finally, sort of public indignation was so great at these accidents that Congress finally acted and passed sort of some of the first transportation regulation in the nation. And it called for inspections. It called for, better standards and boilers and things like that. And the problem was they didn't sort of fund it enough. And a lot of times steamboat inspectors were not well trained. It was sort of a political appointed post. And so that, it didn't have a lot of teeth to it. But finally in the 1850s, I think it was 1855, 1856, after another series of explosions, Congress acted again and passed sort of another steamboat law that really led to enforcing regulations across the industry. So, it took a long time. That's actually the next book I'm gonna work on, is sort of on the Moselle and kind of, the aftermath of that. So I've been digging into that lately, which is why I keep talking about it, because it's sort of fresh in my mind. But that one's been pretty interesting to look into, to see how, very eye-opening. I think we all know this instinctively, but change in this country happens very incrementally and very slowly. And it does take a long time for lawmakers sometimes to act, despite the fact public opposition to something may be great. And this is just sort of reaffirms that for me, which has been kind of an interesting thing as my research continues on that project. Well, thank you all for having me. Any other questions? I appreciate the conversation at the end. Sorry, I'm giving such long-winded answers, but
no, this has been great. I love the discussion and the interaction. It's been fantastic. Thank you to everyone for your thoughtful questions, and thank you, Stuart, for sharing your knowledge with us tonight.
Thanks.
I will put in the plug that if you have not read this book, we do have it at the Paul Sawyer Library. So you come down and check it out. We'd be glad to get that into your hands. I think we have a couple copies of it. So please do stop by and pick one of those up to read. I'm sure you'll want to after this great presentation tonight. So, all right. Well, I just want to thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, especially to our speaker, Stuart Sanders, for being so kind as to share with us tonight. And do keep an eye out in the coming days and week or so. We'll have more programming coming out on the calendar. You can always check on our website, which is www.pspl.org, or our Facebook page to see what is coming up. We've got some really great programming, some virtual programming, of course, but some wonderful opportunities for all ages down at the library. So we do hope to see you very soon, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Diane, thanks again for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Stuart.
Nice seeing everybody.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you all. I'll see you around.
You.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. I'll see you.
Thanks, Stuart.
All right. Bye.